Shortly after my mother-in-law's funeral, my husband inherited a sum of $109 million. His first idea was to divorce me, humiliating me. I didn't say anything, but days later he would regret this decision. I never thought a signature on a piece of paper could rewrite the course of my entire life. But there I was, staring at the cold, indifferent face of the man I had loved for over a decade. Barry sat across from me, leaning back in his chair with the arrogance of someone who had just won a lottery ticket. Except this wasn't luck. This was calculated. "You were always just a placeholder," he muttered, sipping his overpriced whiskey like it was just another Tuesday. I felt the air leave my lungs, my heart shattering into fragments so small, I wondered if I'd ever be able to piece them back together. It wasn't the divorce papers that broke me. It was the timing. Just weeks ago, we were celebrating, toasting to the sudden inheritance that would change our lives forever. $109 million. That's how much his late mother had left behind, and Barry had wasted no time in making it clear that we had never truly existed. The warmth of his touch, the whispered promises in the dead of night. Were they all just well rehearsed? Lines in a play I never knew I was part of? I wanted to scream, to throw the glass of wine I had been holding, but I didn't. I simply stared at him, studying the way he avoided my eyes, the slight twitch in his jaw betraying the cool demeanor he was trying so hard to maintain. He had already planned his exit long before today. That much was obvious. I imagined the secret meetings with lawyers, the careful selection of words to justify his betrayal, the way he probably laughed to himself, thinking I'd never see it coming. Looking back, there were signs. The late-night phone calls he dismissed as work emergencies. The sudden business trips that never seemed to align with his industry. The growing distance between us that I blamed on stress and routine. I had been blind, but Barry had made sure of that. He had wrapped me in sweet words and false security, all while waiting for the perfect moment to cut the strings. And now, with his newfound fortune, he was done pretending. But the most painful part? He wasn't even trying to soften the blow. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just a man eager to shed the last tie to his old life. "You'll be fine," he added, his voice almost bored. Fine? I had stood by him through his failures, sacrificed my own ambitions to support his dreams, and now I was supposed to be fine with being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain still. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. If he wanted a reaction, he wasn't getting one. Instead, I reached for my purse, took out a pen, and signed the divorce papers without a single word. His eyebrow lifted, clearly expecting a fight. "Not today, Barry. Today, I let you believe you won." As I walked out of that office, my body felt light, but my heart was heavy. 11 years. Gone. My mind replayed every moment, every sacrifice, every time I chose to put his needs before mine. Was I really just a placeholder? A temporary fixture in his life until something better, or richer, came along? My stomach churned, a mixture of rage and grief fighting for control. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. I should have gone home, should have curled up under the covers and allowed myself to grieve, but something inside me refused. No. He didn't get to do this to me. Not like this. Barry thought he was done with me. Thought I was just another loose end to tie up in his neatly planned future. He had no idea that the best stories aren't written in the easy chapters. They're written in the aftermath, in the rise from the ashes. And if Barry believed he had just won the jackpot, he was about to learn a lesson far more valuable than any inheritance. Because this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. The silence in my apartment was suffocating. No TV, no music, just the distant hum of the city outside my window. I had spent days replaying every moment, every word Barry had said, trying to make sense of how a life built together could be erased with a signature. I wasn't sleeping much, and when I did, I woke up gasping, haunted by the echo of his voice. You were always just a placeholder. Then the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to pick up. Is this Mrs. Holloway? The voice was calm, professional, but there was something in his tone. Hesitation, maybe. Not for long, I muttered. The divorce papers had already been signed. What else was there to discuss? But then he said something that made my blood run cold. I'm calling about the will. I sat up straight, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The will? As far as I knew, Barry had inherited the money fair and square. His mother's passing had been expected. She had been sick for years, and when the news finally came, Barry acted as if it was just another business transaction. Had he lied about something? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Go on, I said, my voice careful, controlled. There was a pause, and then the lawyer continued. It seems there was a misunderstanding. The document Barry received was not the official final version of the will. I felt my pulse quicken. Not the final version? My mind raced, trying to piece together what this could mean. If there was a mistake, then Barry might not be the sole inheritor after all. I closed my eyes, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. So, what does that mean? I asked, barely above a whisper. The lawyer cleared his throat. It means that Barry might not be entitled to what he thinks he is. My stomach twisted. Barry had blindsided me, discarded me like I was nothing, and now fate was playing its own game. For the first time in days, I smiled. There's something cruel about realizing, all at once, that the years you spent building a life with someone meant nothing to them. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sheer audacity of it. I had been the one holding everything together while Barry chased dreams that never seemed to materialize. I had stretched every dollar, kept our home running, sacrificed my own ambitions so that he could have every opportunity, and in the end, he left me like I was disposable, like I had only been a stepping stone on his way to something better. I could still remember the early days, when we were young and struggling, when Barry was full of ideas but had no real way of making them happen. I had believed in him, maybe more than I should have. Every time one of his projects fell apart, I was the one who picked up the pieces. I worked extra hours to cover the rent when his investments flopped. I was the one who reassured him when he doubted himself, who reminded him that success wasn't instant, that patience and persistence would pay off. I believed in him. But the problem with believing in someone too much is that you don't realize when they've stopped believing in you. I thought about all the nights I spent alone, waiting for him to come home from business meetings that led nowhere. The times I had to swallow my own frustrations, push aside my own dreams, because Barry's dreams always seemed to take priority. When we couldn't afford much, I was the one who figured out how to make ends meet. I clipped coupons. I found creative ways to stretch our groceries. I put my own plans for a master's degree on hold because, according to Barry, once I make it big, you'll have all the time in the world to study. But I never had time, because Barry never made it big, and yet I never resented him for it. Not then, because I thought we were in it together. That was the part that burned the most, not just the betrayal, but the realization that I had been alone for a long time without even knowing it. I remembered the day he first mentioned his mother's inheritance. It was casual, like an afterthought. When my mom passes, I'll finally have some real money to invest. We won't have to scrape by anymore. I had frowned at the way he said it, so detached, so certain that money would just fix everything. And when it came, he wasted no time cutting me out of the picture, I ran a hand through my hair, my chest tightening at the thought of it. The ungratefulness. The sheer selfishness. All those years, I had been his safety net. I had held us together, fought for us when no one else would. And in return, he had thrown me away the second he didn't need me anymore. But now fate was playing its own game. And Barry, he was about to learn just how expensive ingratitude could be. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I had no intention of waiting for it to freeze. The betrayal had ignited something inside me, something sharper than pain, stronger than grief. I had spent years being the patient, understanding, self-sacrificing wife. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had nothing left to lose, and everything to gain. As I sat in my apartment, still clutching the lawyer's papers, a plan started forming in my mind. Barry thought he had won. He thought he had played the perfect game, exiting our marriage with millions while leaving me with nothing but a broken heart. But Barry had always been short-sighted. He never saw the moves being made right under his nose. I poured myself a glass of wine and spread out every document on my dining table. If Barry wasn't the sole inheritor, then what exactly did this updated will say? I needed details. I needed facts. I needed to know exactly where the cracks in his perfect little plan had started to form, because that's where I was going to strike. I scheduled another meeting with Richard, my lawyer. The next morning, I sat across from him in his office, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice steady. "I want to know exactly what Barry is walking into." Richard gave me a knowing smile, sliding another document toward me. Barry's mother wasn't as blind to his flaws as he thought. She didn't trust him with that kind of money, and she certainly didn't want it falling into the hands of someone reckless. My breath hitched as I scanned the pages. Trust fund. Conditions, character requirements. It was all there, buried in the fine print Barry had been too arrogant to read. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly, setting the paper down. "He doesn't just get the money?" "No," Richard confirmed, "not unless he meets the conditions set in place by his mother." A slow, deliberate smile crept onto my face. Barry had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he could manipulate, discard, and move on without consequence. He had celebrated too soon. "How long before he finds out?" I asked, already picturing the look on his face when the truth hit him. "Tomorrow, at the official reading of the will." There are moments in life when everything shifts, when the world you thought you knew tilts just enough for the truth to slip through the cracks. Sitting in that lawyer's office, flipping through page after page of legal jargon, I felt the pieces start to fall into place. Barry wasn't as rich as he thought. He hadn't won the game. He had just stepped into a trap his own mother had set for him, and now I was the only one who knew. "Tell me more about this trust fund," I said, tapping my fingernail against the thick document in front of me. Richard, ever the patient professional, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "It was created years ago," he explained, "long before Barry even suspected it existed. His mother knew her son. She knew his flaws, and she was smart enough to protect her fortune from being squandered." I let out a slow breath, a bitter smile creeping onto my lips. I had spent over a decade cleaning up Barry's messes, holding everything together while he jumped from one impulsive decision to another. And now, even his own mother had known better than to trust him. "So, how does it work?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "The money isn't just his," Richard clarified. "It's locked away in a trust fund. The only way he can access it is by proving he's changed, by meeting certain character and responsibility requirements." I blinked, processing the weight of those words. Character and responsibility. Two things Barry had spent his entire life avoiding. And if he doesn't meet those requirements? Richard's eyes flickered with something I could only describe as amusement. "Then the inheritance is forfeited." I exhaled sharply, Forfeited. Not just delayed, not just limited. Completely gone. Barry had walked out of our marriage believing he was walking into a life of unimaginable wealth. He had cut me loose like an anchor, thinking he was finally free. But in reality, he had been floating toward disaster the entire time. Who determines if he meets the requirements? I asked, my mind already racing with possibilities. That would be the trustee, Richard said, a court-appointed executor responsible for ensuring the terms are upheld. And who is the trustee? Richard's lips twitched, almost as if he had been waiting for me to ask that very question. He slid another page toward me, and the second I saw the name printed on it, my breath caught in my throat. It was me. The room suddenly felt smaller, the weight of what I was holding pressing down on me in a way I hadn't expected. I was the trustee, the one person who now had the power to decide Barry's financial fate. The irony was almost too much to process. This can't be right, I muttered, scanning the document again as if the words would change. It's very much right, Richard assured me. Barry's mother named you personally. She wanted someone who truly knew him, someone who wouldn't be easily deceived by empty promises or superficial change. I let out a hollow laugh. She had certainly chosen the right person. Barry had underestimated me in every way possible. He had spent our marriage assuming I would always be there, always forgiving, always willing to sacrifice myself for him. But now, I was the one holding the keys to everything he wanted. I could already picture his reaction. The shock, the rage. The moment when he realized that the woman he had tossed aside so effortlessly was now the one person who could decide his future. So, let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward. Barry has no idea this trust fund exists? None, Richard confirmed. As far as he's concerned, he walked away with $109 million. He won't realize the truth until tomorrow, at the official reading of the will. I tapped my fingers against the desk, considering my next move. This was more than just an inheritance. It was a test. His mother had left behind a final challenge, a final opportunity for Barry to prove himself. What are the conditions? I asked. Richard smirked. Oh, you're going to love this. He handed me another page, and as I read the carefully laid out stipulations, I felt a slow, simmering satisfaction rise in my chest. Barry wasn't just expected to behave better. He had to prove it. The conditions were brutal. He had to hold a steady job for at least 5 years. No shortcuts, no investments, no business ventures that relied on other people's money. He had to demonstrate financial responsibility, undergo counseling for his questionable decision-making skills, and, this was my personal favorite, he had to maintain a genuine long-term relationship without cheating, manipulation, or selfishness. Bit my lip, trying not to laugh. Barry had never worked a steady job in his life. He had always believed he was too smart for regular employment, always chasing the next big idea that never quite materialized. And as for the relationship clause, that man wouldn't last 6 months without lying or deceiving someone. So let me guess, I said, folding my arms. If he fails any of these conditions, then the inheritance is revoked permanently, Richard finished, and the money goes to you instead. Silence stretched between us as I let that reality sink in. I had walked into this office expecting to find scraps of information, maybe some minor loophole that would cause Barry inconvenience. I hadn't expected this. What happens if I refuse to be the trustee? I asked, testing the waters. Richard shook his head. You don't have that option. If you reject the role, the money is automatically forfeited, and Barry gets nothing. That's how his mother designed it. Either you hold him accountable, or the money disappears entirely. I let out a slow breath, my mind whirling. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about power. And for the first time in my life, I had it. I had spent years watching Barry walk away from responsibility, from effort, from me. Now, he would have to earn every single penny he had been so eager to flaunt. And something told me he wasn't going to make it. For the first time since Barry shattered my world, I wasn't just surviving. I was winning. The next morning, I arrived at the law firm early, dressed in confidence and a carefully rehearsed calm. Today was the day Barry would find out the truth, the day his arrogant smirk would falter, the day his carefully constructed world would begin to crumble. I had waited for this moment, but I knew I couldn't let my emotions betray me. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Barry waltzed in 15 minutes late, as expected. He looked exactly as I remembered. Tailored suit, expensive watch, an air of smug self-importance radiating off him. He had no idea what was coming. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Richard," Barry greeted the lawyer with that fake charm he used when he wanted something. "Let's get this over with. I've got meetings to attend." I bit back a smile. "Oh, you're not going to those meetings, Barry. Not after today." Richard cleared his throat, flipping through the legal documents in front of him. "Mr. Holloway, there are some things we need to go over. It appears there were some conditions tied to your inheritance that were not previously disclosed." Barry frowned, barely paying attention. Yeah, legal formalities. Just tell me what I need to sign." Richard adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Barry, you don't have the money." Silence. Barry's smirk flickered. "What?" "The inheritance isn't yours yet," Richard clarified. "Your mother placed it in a trust with very specific conditions that must be met before you can access it." Barry laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "You're joking." "I assure you, I'm not." I watched as realization began to dawn in his eyes. The confidence, the entitlement, it all started to drain away. "What kind of conditions?" Barry asked, his voice tight. Richard slid the document across the table. "You must maintain a stable, full-time job for 5 years, demonstrate responsible financial management, and seek counseling to address certain behavioral patterns." Barry's jaw clenched. "That's ridiculous. It's my money." "Not yet," Richard corrected, his tone neutral. "And there's one more thing. You must be in a committed, long-term relationship without infidelity, deception, or manipulation." Barry blinked. "Excuse me?" I nearly burst out laughing. The irony was delicious. "Your mother wanted to ensure you had truly changed before entrusting you with her fortune," Richard explained. "If you fail to meet these conditions, the inheritance is permanently revoked." Barry was turning red, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "And where does the money go if I don't meet these conditions?" Richard finally looked at me. To her. Barry's head snapped in my direction, eyes widening in disbelief. For the first time since this entire ordeal started, he was speechless. And it was glorious. There was something intoxicating about watching Barry's world crumble before my eyes. It was like a slow-motion train wreck, only I was the one who had laid the tracks. The man who had once sat across from me with a smirk, who had discarded me without a second thought, was now pale, trembling, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair as if the right words might somehow appear if he held on tightly enough. "This..." Barry's voice cracked, a strangled mix of anger and disbelief. He cleared his throat and tried again. "This is a mistake." Richard, ever the picture of professionalism, merely folded his hands on the desk. "The legal documents are very clear, Mr. Holloway." I could have laughed. The arrogance, the sheer entitlement, the way Barry believed he could bend reality to his will. It was all unraveling, and he had no idea how to stop it. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he could manipulate, discard, and move on without consequence. And now, here he was, powerless. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Every muscle in my body was relaxed in a way it hadn't been in years. "You knew," Barry accused, finally turning to me, his eyes dark with fury. "You knew about this, didn't you?" "Not at first," I admitted, unable to keep the amusement out of my voice. "But once I did, well, let's just say it was worth the wait." Barry's nostrils flared. He wanted to lash out, to turn this into a scene. But he knew better. There was no getting out of this. No loophole, no manipulation that could undo what his mother had written into that will. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the cards. I should have walked away then, should have left him there drowning in his own mess. But I stayed. Not because I needed to, not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because I wanted him to understand something. There was no coming back from this. "So, let me get this straight," Barry said, his voice tight with barely restrained rage. "I have to work a real job for 5 years, prove I can be financially responsible, and, what was it? Oh, right, maintain a functional monogamous relationship, or else I get nothing." "You make it sound so difficult," I mused, tilting my head. Barry's jaw clenched so hard I thought he might shatter a tooth. "And if I don't?" "Then the money is mine," I said, watching as the words landed like a physical blow. Barry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think you've won, don't you?" I thought about that for a moment. Had I won? For weeks I had dreamed about this moment. Dreamed about seeing the desperation in his eyes, watching him panic as his entire future was stripped away. And now that it was happening, I felt... what? Satisfied? Maybe. Justified? Absolutely. But victorious? The truth was, Barry had already taken too much from me. Years of my life. Dreams I had postponed. Ambitions I had set aside. I had already lost too much time to him. And if I spent the rest of my life clinging to this moment, gloating in his misery, then wasn't I still letting him control me? "No," I said finally, standing up. "I don't think I've won. I think I'm just done playing." Barry scoffed, but I saw it. The flicker of uncertainty, the realization that, for the first time, I wasn't reacting to him. "Enjoy your new reality, Barry," I said, adjusting my bag over my shoulder. "I certainly will." And then I left, for a while, the high of Barry's downfall carried me. I went home that night and poured myself a glass of wine, replaying every second of that meeting like it was the best movie I had ever watched. I slept better than I had in years, waking up without the weight of him pressing down on my chest. But as time passed, something strange happened. The satisfaction began to fade. I had spent so long waiting for Barry to pay for what he had done, so long imagining the perfect revenge, that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next. What did I do now? For years, my life had been about him, about his ambitions, his failures, his betrayals, and even after the divorce, my focus had still been on him, on taking him down, on making sure he felt the weight of his own actions. And now that he did, what did that mean for me? I found myself restless, pacing my apartment at night, my mind buzzing with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. Barry was ruined. He had no access to his money, no easy way out. And yet, thinking about him still took up space in my mind. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Had I really freed myself? Or had I just traded one version of obsession for another? I didn't like the answer. One night, as I sat on my couch staring at the city lights outside my window, a thought came to me, a quiet, insistent whisper in the back of my mind. What if true power isn't about revenge? What if it's about taking back your own life? The thought unsettled me, because if that was true, then I had been going about this all wrong. I didn't just need to win against Barry. I needed to stop, letting him be part of my story altogether. That night, I made a decision. I went to my desk, pulled out a notebook, and started writing. Not about Barry, not about revenge, but about me. What did I want? Not in reaction to him, not as some final act of retribution, but for myself. I listed everything I had put on hold. My master's degree, the business I had always wanted to start, the trips I had dreamed about but never taken. I stared at the list for a long time. Then I picked up my phone. First, I called my lawyer. "Richard, I need to talk about the trust fund." "Of course," he said, sounding intrigued. "What are you thinking?" "I don't want to waste this money on punishing Barry," I admitted. "I want to use it to build something that has nothing to do with him." Richard was silent for a moment, then chuckled. "Now that," he said, "is what real power looks like." The next call I made was to a university. I wanted to enroll in the master's program I had put off for too long, and just like that, the shift began. Barry had taken years from me. But I wasn't going to let him have one more second. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was a new beginning. I started traveling, just small trips at first. A weekend by the ocean, a solo getaway to the mountains. I rediscovered what it meant to be alone without being lonely, to exist without being defined by someone else. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of a small villa in Italy, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, I realized something. I wasn't just healing. I was thriving. Barry had taken so much from me. But in the end, he had given me something too. A reason to rebuild. A reason to become more. A reason to take back my life. And this time, no one would take it from me. It had been almost a year since I last saw Barry. In that time, I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. My business was thriving. My education was back on track. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Without him. Without revenge. Without the weight of the past anchoring me down. I had spent so much of my life in Barry's shadow, bending to his whims, making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. But now, I stood tall. No longer tethered to the wreckage of our past. No longer waiting for justice or retribution. And for the most part, I no longer thought about him. Barry had become nothing more than a cautionary tale in my mind. He was the storm that had passed, the mistake I had outgrown, the chapter I had closed. That's why, when an envelope arrived in the mail with his handwriting on it, I hesitated. For a long time. I just stared at it, my fingers grazing over the edges, debating whether or not I should even open it. A part of me wanted to tear it in half without a second thought. What could Barry possibly have to say to me now? But another part of me, the part that had learned to look at my past without fear, wanted to know. Not because I still cared, but because I wanted to see what kind of man he had become when there was no one left to clean up his mess. So I sat down, inhaled deeply, and opened it. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. You were right. About everything. About me. About who I was. I see it now, but it's too late. I lost everything. My money, my so-called friends, my reputation. I thought I could game the system, but it turns out the system was smarter than me. The moment people realized I didn't have access to the inheritance, they vanished. My business connections? Gone. The women who were suddenly interested in me after I became rich? Gone. Even my old friends, the ones I thought would always have my back, suddenly had excuses when I needed them. I'm broke, and worse, I'm alone. No one wants to be around me now that I have nothing to offer them. I guess that's what happens when you build a life on selfishness. I used to think you were weak for putting up with me. But now I see that you were the strongest person I ever knew, and I was too much of a coward to appreciate it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a response. But if you ever think of me, I just hope it's not with hate. I hope you remember me as a fool who learned his lesson too late. I'm sorry for everything. Barry, I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe anger, maybe a twisted sense of satisfaction. But what I felt was something far more surprising. I felt nothing. For years, I had imagined what it would be like for Barry to realize what he had lost. I had dreamed of this moment, convinced that seeing him fall would be the final piece of my closure. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like a victory, because I had already won. I had won the day I stopped letting him dictate my emotions. I had won the day I chose to rebuild myself instead of wasting my time seeking revenge. I had won the moment I realized that moving on wasn't about watching him fail. It was about making sure I thrived. Barry's suffering was his own doing. It had nothing to do with me anymore. And so, I took the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it back inside the envelope. I considered keeping it, tucking it away somewhere as a reminder of how far I had come. But then I thought, why would I hold on to something that no longer had power over me? So, without hesitation, I tossed it into the fireplace and watched it burn. As the flames consumed the last remnants of Barry's words, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. Not triumph, not smugness, just peace. Barry was a chapter I had already finished, and I was finally free to start the next one.